The Royal Scottish Academy of Art and Architecture is delighted to welcome Victoria Crowe, whom the Academy wish to honour by inviting her to give the 2019 Gillies Lecture. She is one of the most esteemed artists working in Britain today. Vicky has many honours and awards and has completed numerous important commissions. Her wonderful works feature in public and private collections all over the world. When Sir William Gillies died in 1973, the bulk of his estate was bequeathed to the RSA to establish a fund, the income of which was to be voted to educational and charitable purposes. The Gillies Memorial Lecture was established in 1978. The initial lecture was given by Lord Kenneth Clarke, HRSA, on collectors and collecting. There then followed a long line of distinguished speakers, including Yehudi Menuhin, Sir Jeremy Isaacs, the designer Jean Muir, Sir John Layton, to name a few. And in 2010, Professor Duncan Macmillan, HRSA, gave the lecture in Aberdeen Art Gallery in honour of Frances Walker and her show Place Observed in Solitude, about her paintings from her trip to Antarctica. Vicky is therefore the only second Royal Scottish Academician to be accorded this privilege in all these years. Victoria Crowe first studied at Kingston School of Art, where one of her tutors was the greatly revered artist Prunella Clough. She then went on to do postgraduate study at the Royal College of Art, where tutors included Carol Waite, Leonard Rosamond and Peter Blake. After that, Vicky came up to Scotland and went on to teach in Edinburgh College of Art for 30 years and will have inspired 3 decades of students, many of whom are now the established artists of today. Vicky's lecture is entitled In the Beginning and follows on from an extraordinary period of nearly 2 years where her work has been on constant show in blockbuster exhibitions. From May to November 2018, Beyond Likeness was exhibited in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, bringing together many of her finest portraits for the first time. From May 2019, Victoria Crowe, 50 Years of Painting, has been on show in the Edinburgh City Arts Centre, and that ends on the 13th of October. Despite being seriously unwell for several months during the summer, Vicky then bravely agreed to have another fascinating exhibition, Drawing and Thinking in the Scottish Gallery, a show of her sketchbooks, studies and drawings. Every exhibition has been a revelation, not only in our awe at the amount and variety of work accomplished over the 50 years, but also by the sheer virtuosity, aesthetic and sensitivity apparent in every single piece. In her portraits, the insight and connection with the sitters, plus the challenging compositions, lifts them sky high above the ordinary dull academic renditions to be seen in lofty halls of business and academia. Artists tend to view work differently from non-artists, not by the subject matter, but by the evidence of making and how the journey develops from the smallest scribble. Most importantly is how imagination, backed up by accurate observation, can transcend pure imitation. Vicky is the master in achieving this goal. And to finish off, and in Vicky's words, when I am painting, all I'm really thinking about are the abstract qualities within the work, the interplay of transparent and opaque paint, the drama of saturated or muted colour, and the overall tonal control. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Vicky Crowe to take us through her 50-year journey from In the Beginning. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Joyce, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I had no idea there were so many illustrious names going before me in the Gillies Lectures. So I won't be daunted. I'll try not to be anyway. This lecture is called From the Beginning, simply because with the retrospective exhibitions that have been on over the last 2 years, I started to think very much about the roots of where the ideas have come from in my paintings and how they've developed. it's a little bit like when you look back to childhood memories, there's an intensity about those first memories, those early memories. And it's a little bit like that with looking back at things we discovered as artists when we first went to art college, that suddenly things were made clear to us. So I can't really recreate the 60s for you. I've had a good try. This is me at my degree show at 1968. But I put together a loop of images which, of not of my paintings, but of paintings and photographs that have inspired me. And if we can, almost by assimilation, you can see the kind of mindset that I had as a student. So I started at Kingston School of Art for 4 years, and then, as Joyce mentioned, the Royal College of Art for a 3-year postgraduate. Weren't we lucky? That was a fantastic time. And I felt that my real education began when I was about 16, which is when I went to art college. I was with like-minded people. I was discovering so much, and I was in love with the alchemy of painting. I loved the materials. I was interested how colour can be fugitive or transparent or opaque. There's strange things that happen with flake white, for instance. Perhaps not a lot of people know this, but if you paint with flake white and you put your painting in a cupboard, it will go yellow. It needs the light. The wonderful names, Indian yellow. Was it really made from cow's urine fed with mango and leaves in India? And also caput mortuum, which really was dead head because it was a brownish purple made up from Egyptian mummies. I've still got a tube of it somewhere. Now, one of the people who was really important in my development was Prunella Clough. She was an artist who came as a visiting tutor to Kingston. She was, I suppose, one of the, maybe you'd call it the neo-romantics. The people that she worked and was most closely associated with were people like Keith Vaughan and McBride and Cahoon, that's right. And sort of latterly, I guess, from Sutherland as well. So those kind of influences, but she was very much her own person. And the thing that she extended to all of us was this idea that the painting was an object in its own right. It wasn't a simulacrum for something out there. It had a value, abstract values really, where you could manipulate the picture plane, where you could control the tone, think about the composition, and so it became very much an object in its own right. And that is something I've sort of thought about all through my career, really, how a painting can relate to something in the real world, but at the same time have these very, very strong abstract values. Another good thing that happened when I was at Kingston Art College was when we did our painting specialism in the penultimate and ultimate year, we were joined by 4 very cool guys from northern art colleges, one of which was Mike. So I met him when I was 18, and we've sort of been together ever since, sort of. The other very important thing that happened then was that I took my first visit abroad, and I went to Russia. I'd never been outside of England before, and it was a National Union of Students trip that went by train through Belgium, West Germany, East Germany, Poland. We stopped in Warsaw for a couple of nights, over into Moscow and Leningrad. Now, the kind of influences that I'd had at that time were very much the Italian so-called primitives, people like Piero della Francesca, Uccello, Giotto. And I found in Russia there was a sort of link with a lot of the icon painting out there, particularly the Andrei Rublev, very sublime paintings, which I found had a quality about them which did exactly what I was trying to do. It was of the real world, but it was also of its own structure, its own intent. Now, the word icon is really quite interesting in that now it's used in all sorts of ways. It's sort of bandied about by, iconic dress or an iconic celebrity or something. But when you think of it as an object which has a very, very great power all of its own, you can see how I was beginning to think and relate it to the sort of images I was interested in. Now, icons such as this also influenced people like Matisse. There was a little quote, he said it helped one jump the ditch when he was looking for a formal way of working figuratively. And also people like Polyakov, who was an abstract painter in the 60s, and people like Victor Pasmo, our own, the development of abstraction in Britain. But also for me in Russia, there was the development from the Rublev icon through to Eisenstein's films, which we've seen excerpts of here, but also to Malevich and to Kandinsky, because Malevich had a way of distilling the essence of something, and, for example, this painting, and he was looking at what people in the theatre and the cinema were doing in Russia at that time, which was to move away from imitation and towards what they called the fourth dimension, which was really looking at spiritual values, the transcendence movement. And I found that a really, really compelling series of ideas. The Eisenstein films, such as this here, I found amazing because of their compositional aspects. And Eisenstein himself would actually do little thumbnail sketches to indicate to the filmmakers the power of the image that he wanted to use. See the figures at the top and this great curve of figures at the bottom. So he was using all these elements in what he called montage, so that in the Odessa step sequence, which you will have seen some of here, he was using different aspects of the same scene, adding them together and making a completely different reality. Now, things like the Italian primitives, they were looking for these spiritual qualities, and this is a particularly good example of the Malevich look for spiritual and transcendent qualities. Now, I've got Gwen John in there as well, because I had to live in the real world. I couldn't just be really so theoretical. And in many ways, I'd often wished I could have been an abstract painter, but it never happened for me. I always got torn between the abstraction of the composition and the power of the real world. So I think if we can now perhaps go to some of my own paintings, you'll be able to see how that, hopefully, how that collage, that little film, has begun to influence the things that I did when I was a student. Now, this image here at the Royal College is, you can't really see the paintings, unfortunately, they're further back here, so all you're looking at are some of the drawings. So this is what I was trying to do with the icon, the Rublev icon that you would have seen. All that was in my mind at the time was to try and analyze how the proportions and the distortions of the icon could be set against my own face. So I was using that very much, almost mask-like. I think the power, that's what I was really trying to do. And I think by flattening the picture plane, I was also doing these things that icons do, which they don't allow you into the illusionary space. You're thrown back again by the gold background or by the inverse perspective that they use. There's a sort of subtext to this in that, having been brought up in a Catholic convent grammar school, I left the church when I was about 21, I think, which was a great wrench, but it was an intellectual decision to do that. But I've always looked for the transitory and something that will make numinous, if you like, a different kind of reason and reality. Now, this is called Trees in Richmond Park. And it was the first lot of trees. This was when I was at Kingston Art College. And what I'd been doing here was really by reducing the palette and using pumice powder to thicken the paint. It was again looking at what Prunella Clough had taught us, which was to make the object the painting that you were working on, so that the image was much more about what was going on in here than what was going on out there. It wasn't related to external reality. This was our back garden in Hammersmith. Peter Blake was one of our tutors, and so there was a kind of pop art influence as well. You can see some of the grid marks here, which again was an attempt to say, look, by the way, this isn't an illusion, this isn't really a laurel bush, it's a bit of paint with texture on it. Or this isn't really a ground with lichen on, it is the kind of abstract values of that distressed paint. Then I came up to Scotland. I'd never been to Scotland before. This was about 3 months after that picture of me standing there in my mini dress at the Royal College, and I was confronted with this amazing landscape of the Pennant Hills. We decided to go out, not to live in Edinburgh, but to take the radial roads out and to find the most dramatic piece of countryside we could. And this was just above Marchwell on the way out to Carlops. I took Modigliani's Rosa Proprina with me into this painting. It seemed to me very appropriate to carry her forward from my student days into this new environment. That house was designed by Robert Steadman, who's a RSA member, an architect member. And we lived opposite there for 18 months. And I used to stand out waiting for the early bus to go in to teach at Edinburgh College of Art. It was absolutely freezing, and often the moon was still in the sky. So these very, very dramatic images stayed with me for a long, long time. Sometimes when I was painting things like this, the paint would freeze, and I'd never had that happen before. We moved to Kitleanow in 1970, and this was sort of trying to get to grips with the landscape. Now, in a way, I didn't have any precedent. I didn't know a lot about Scottish landscape painting. The landscape painting I'd seen at home, in England was very, very different. So I had no rules to go by, and therefore I had no rules to break. And I remember thinking when I was doing this, that it reminded me of the Uccello painting, the Rout of San Romano, with all those staves and banners hitting the skyline. So again, I was thinking about that rather than about trying to describe exactly how the back garden worked. This was the other part of our domain. This is the side of the house where we were. We were there for 20 years. We were neighbour to Jennie Armstrong for 15 years. And it was an incredibly beautiful, isolated place. We were only about 17 miles south of Edinburgh. And in those days, the trip into town was about, 25, 30 minutes in the car. It's not like that now. You can see in the forefront of this picture, there's the marks of the car. And we were the first ones up there to have a car, Morris Minor. We arrived with all our worldly possessions on the roof of the Morris Minor. But in fact, there's now about 10 cars up at Kitleanow. So we were the ones that started the rot, I'm afraid. But the beauty and the quality of light was something that I continued to work with for a long, long time. This painting was the first time Jennie appeared in any of them, and she was our next-door neighbour. There were only 3 very small cottages and a sort of ruined farm at the top. And I used her as a sort of cipher in this painting to explain about the landscape, the intensity and the vastness of this broken moorland. We were nearly 1,000 feet up, and all of that background behind the figure, you can see the reeds and the grasses growing through. There's a bit more centre stage in this one, and feeding the sheep. She became very, very important to me. From our house, you could see, out of every window, you could see the landscape. And gradually this little figure and her work became an intriguing part of what was going on within it. Right at the top in the centre on the skyline is a cottage called Harbour Craig, which is quite near some of the conventicles that are still held at the back of Kitlinau. So it was quite an ancient sort of landscape as well. All this was subsequently changed when there were illegal peat removal and illegal coal mining. But at that time, there was this sort of wonderful, pristine quality to the land. And this was a drawing from our studio up towards the ruined farmstead. I get a lot of my information through drawing. You can just see the end of Jennie's cottage there, the sheep. Now, at this time I was teaching at Edinburgh, and I found the transition to teaching there really quite difficult, because the kinds of traditions, not only was everybody that I taught with, well, out of 30, there was about 3 women, I think, and most of the lecturers there not only were Scottish, but had been trained at Edinburgh College of Art, so there was an assumed language, an assumed truth of what you taught in that place, which I found very, very difficult to pick up on, because I'd come from a different kind of tradition. So the solitude of Kitlinau was a wonderful place to go and think about the role of an artist, what it is you actually are contributing to your students, to your own work. And also, as a young woman, I was wondering, would I have kids? Would I still be able to be an artist if I had children? Would I still be able to function as a teacher, as a wife, as a mother? All of these things. And in a strange way, the wisdom of this old woman that lived next door to me answered a lot of these questions, because she was so totally acceptant of the way her life was, and she was sure of the kind of rhythms of nature, which was something I hadn't really thought very much about. So this is her on a Christmas, you can see from the cards above, looking from her cottage out into the landscape. And this sort of surety that Jennie had, that in the winter you didn't work so hard. You went out when the light was still there, you fed your animals, you came back in. In the summer, you'd be up from 6 till 10 or 11, using all of the light. But in the winter, you hunkered down. This is what you hunkered down to. So it was a simple cottage that she lived in, just 2 rooms, and the range, of course, was the centre of it. This one is called Range and Semmet, so she had her vest drying. But often there'd be kindlers drying, there'd be sick lambs brought in, the odd chicken would wander through as well. And the sort of still life at the top was kind of quite important as well, because Jennie's life was sort of seen through these objects. There was this other part of her that did occasionally put a bit of brilliantine on her hair, or did occasionally use powder. Now, anybody that knew much about Jennie's life and her house would recognize in this painting that something big had changed. You can see the bed at the bottom here. And she, unfortunately, had both her legs amputated, and she came back to live in the cottage, but now her world had become this one room. So she slept in here, people came and looked after her in here, the fire was made up. It's called Messages because on the dresser, there's sort of bananas and an apple. And people like the postman and the milkman and her neighbours would come in every day, and that is how that woman kept going for 18 months in this cottage with no central heating. With a telephone eventually, she did agree to that. And this is the last portrait of her. And it was painted actually after Jennie died from a little tiny sketch I'd made of her one day when we were in talking. She could no longer keep her beloved dog, but you can see there's a budgie right on the far side. And she had fun with that budgie. And I sometimes, you see, when I look at that painting, I hardly see the wheelchair. I see the sort of strength of that personality. And I see the warmth and the colour and the sort of strong person that Jennie was. So I don't feel that it's a tragic painting in any way. I feel it's a transcendent kind of painting. I did a series of drawings which the National Gallery have recently acquired. There were these big charcoal drawings of looking at that room and almost trying to draw the absence of somebody. It's called Jennie in the Shadows, but in fact that was just a kind of big mess of charcoal that happened to become figure-like at one point. But it had this kind of sense of there being somebody there, of the room being animated by that dark. And this is called Private View with Plastic Tulips, and it is very much a painting, a remembered painting of Jennie's room. The plastic tulips were things that she got free with Daz in the 1950s, and she'd stick proudly in her jar. There were some little toys, a couple of things from Russia that I'd bought her back, and windows looking out onto the other side, and then the sunlight, really transforming that room. After she died, I took some photographs of that room, and it was just unbearably sad and horrible. They were black and white photographs, and the place just looked cold and dirty and neglected and miserable, so I was never able to use them. This is far more what Monk's Cottage had been about. Now, at the time of Jennie's death, I met another very interesting and powerful woman. This was Winifred Rushforth, who was one of the first women to study medicine in Edinburgh. And she went as a medical missionary out to India, but she came back in her 40s and started a whole new career down at the Tavistock Clinic, where she studied Jungian psychology. And she set up in Edinburgh as one of the first analytical therapists. And she gave free access to people who wanted to go and discuss problems with her. She was an immensely wise and powerful woman. And one or two comments about this painting in the past were, but Winifred had little pink cheeks and she was very sweet and all the rest of it. Well, she was also very, very strong. And that's the aspect that I wanted to use. And by putting her against the light, I think you get the kind of power of that woman, and juxtaposing it against this sculpture, which is of a bushman. Lawrence van der Post wrote about the bushman, and she was quite influenced by that book. And it's this kind of thing of the primordial scream, I suppose. So her thinking influenced me very much, and we joined one of her dream groups, which was an absolute revelation. I really had not thought very much about the collective unconscious and about the archetype and about the Jungian symbolism. So that started off a whole new range of ideas for me. And this was another portrait. Our children by then, I did go on to have 2 children. Our children by then, Ben was getting piano lessons from Arnold Stevenson, who lived in West Linton. And Ronald taught him far more than how to play the piano. Ronald taught him musicality. He was a hugely gifted teacher and a very, very creative thinker and intellectual. He too knew about Jung, so we had lots of ideas in common. You can see there's MacDermid, there's an image of him there, Percy Grainger and Busoni, who were his sort of heroes. And Ronald really took our son, our daughter didn't have lessons with him, into this kind of wonderful inner world of music. So he was a very powerful influence. And then I got the commission to paint R.D. Laing. This was from the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. It was the first commissioned piece. And I'd known R.D. Laing's work for years because a friend of ours at Kingston had suffered schizophrenia, so I read a lot. I wanted to try and understand what on earth was going on. And so when Duncan Thompson gave me this commission, I was absolutely delighted because of all the people I would like to meet. R.D. Laing was the one. It was quite a difficult commission in many ways because he does have a reputation as a maverick, and he certainly didn't have the kind of gracious behaviour I thought he maybe would have had. So there was an uncompromising look to him, and there was an absolute sort of certainty about where he was at, and the kind of things he was thinking about. He also, obviously, we talked about Jung as well, but also Kathleen Raine, who's another person I painted. And in this, if you can remember back to the Jennie paintings, it was the objects which were saying something else about the sitter. So that there were, for instance, the crystal on the shelf behind him, which he used to say was one way of looking at the world. And it was an alternative way of looking at the world. He also had a little icon up there, which was a kind of mysterious object because it wasn't real. It was the Veronica. It was the veil that the impression of Christ's face was on, and it was painted, and it was only that big. So there were so many different ways that it was removed from a realistic portrait. And there's also the Peter Blake Eve naming the birds, which for him was very important to have a kind of female presence in the room. The bit I loved most of all in all of this, apart from R.D. Laing, I mean, was the little book down at the lower left-hand corner, which was one of his book covers, and it shows a Bosch painting of a man and woman struggling within the outline of a human head with the all-seeing eye of God above it. So it's a great privilege to meet somebody like Ronnie Laing. Now, I talked about Kathleen Raine and also Janet Vaughan. They were 2 other very, very important women in that poetry and that metaphor for reality. I learned a lot through Kathleen Raine and through Janet, the fact that this woman I was sitting painting, I'd seen a programme about her on telly and I really wanted to meet her. She was one of the medical team that had liberated Belsen. So there I was sitting in front of this incredibly, this woman that held all this image of what she had seen in her face. So these were kind of now beginning to be extensions to the sort of theoretical things I'd been thinking about painting, into the sort of life experience. And this was a painting about Ben when he was about 18, 19, and he was just going up to Aberdeen University. Now, we'd left Kitley now. After Jennie's death, about sort of 5 years afterwards, the whole spirit of the place began very, very much to change. The houses were developed. You had ensuite bathrooms in these houses. There were about 5 of them. There were landscaped gardens. That actual wonderful microcosm of our children's childhood and my kind of awareness of life at that stage, that had all changed. So we had to move. It was a big upheaval. It was a bit like leaving the church all over again. It was something that we had to do, but was very painful. And it shows a remembered view of Kitley now, where it was in the first Gulf War, about 1991, and the army were practicing by dropping parachutes on Auchencorth Moss, just behind us. And Ben is standing there, this young man in his Beach Boys shirt, stepping onto the kind of future, looking out. This was what was before him. And one of his schoolmates from Peebles High School was actually out in the Gulf War, hence all these references to camouflage and soldiers down here. And there was this feeling of the vulnerability of young men at that stage in their life. Now, I then went, thank you very much, Sir William Gillies Research Award. I went to Italy. Now, I'd been to Russia, I'd been to Greece, I'd been to Poland. I'd never been to Italy, and so I went on my own in 1992 and did a sort of study tour. Saw all the paintings that I had dreamt about as a student. Saw all the artifacts, saw the landscapes, which almost looked like they could have been a background from a Piero della Francesca, for instance. You saw that slide of the angel with the beautiful hillside behind it. And I was thinking as well about that kind of hidden geometry in the lands, in the paintings of the Italian primitives. And this is a self-portrait. It was drawn when I was in the Uffizi, and there was a big dark glazed painting in front of me, so I saw my own reflection. And I also saw, there's another version of this, I also saw the reflection of the Leonardo da Vinci Annunciation with the angels, you know, sort of doing that. And it was a kind of holding the moment. I want to go and look at this so much, but I'm just going to anticipate going to look at it. And I was intrigued with all those Italian, the way the lily was used as a symbol, the way the angel, the kind of message, what did it mean? The kind of symbols of the eternal space of creation, as you can see up in the oculus here. And it's set against a life cast of a friend. So in a way, it's like a sort of Annunciation painting, but of course it's not. It's about a different kind of message. There was a whole lot of paintings that I did round about that time where you were looking at the kind of symbolic meaning and how images could contrive together, a little bit like the Eisenstein film sets, to give you a different reality. And this one is very much case in point because this was now in 1995, and after Ben had done his 3rd year at Aberdeen University, he was diagnosed with cancer and he was ill for just about a whole year. And the last exhibition that he ever came to was at the Scottish Gallery, and I was given these lilies by the gallery as a sort of, thank you for your show. And that was the last sort of great gift that Ben gave to both Mike and myself, to be there for that. And I took these lilies home, and in the month between the end of the show and Ben's death, this painting was painted. So it's troubled. I'm there as a shadow, as a backlit figure, as an anonymous figure almost, while these blooming flowers, with all their strength and power, carried on growing and burgeoning. And the background is really when you turn a light on in the winter and you get the room thrown back, but you also see some of the outside. So it was a mixture of what was going on outside, what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and these plants. Now, when Ben died, I painted a lot about the immovable and the enduring against the fragile and the transitory. And I found that was one way that I could, almost in a kind of parallel life, think about the horrible stuff that had gone on and about his loss and our grief and all of this. And I think maybe sort of 4 or 5 years, these paintings carried that same kind of message. Look at the delicacy of that. Look at the enduring waves, the tide, all these rhythms. A slightly different one. I don't know if you can recognize Harbour Craig right up there, bang in the centre again, this looking back to our old life. And that's a skein of clematis, which links these. It's called Landscape with Powerful Objects. And I feel they are powerful. The butterfly was from India, incredibly beautiful, but it's a dead butterfly. It's pinned on a piece of card. The dominance of the moon, Virgin and Child, self-portrait, thinking, what the hell's going on here? And all joined together by the unity of that plant, which in itself is quite a symbol, isn't it? Now, this painting belongs to the Royal Scottish Academy. And round about the time I did this, the Shepherd's Life exhibition was brought together at the Portrait Gallery. And I hadn't really looked at landscape for a long, long time. It must have been about 8, maybe 10 years where I was dealing with the influence of Italy and the aftermath of Ben. But I went back to look at the landscape then. But it's not such a friendly landscape. It's I find that quite a disturbing image. Again, because I guess we've got these votive objects. There's the Ian Hamilton Finlay Apollyon at the far end. And okay, so he was god of learning and justice, but also god of plague. And the red stripes at either end are very much reference to a Japanese Macbeth theatre production we saw in the King's Theatre, when at certain times the screen would close. And I almost feel it's going to happen in that painting at any moment, that screen is just going to close and we'll see nothing. And then, as often happens in my life, along comes something completely different. And this was in the form of a portrait commission of David Ingram, who used to be Regius Professor at the Botanic Gardens here in Edinburgh. And at this time, he was president of St Catherine's College down in Cambridge. And he wanted me to paint him. And one of the charming things about David was that he got so excited about lettuce wilt and potato blight and the smuts and the downy mildews. He was a plant pathologist. And a lot of our conversation was around his work and the kind of images from his work. St Catherine's College, they have the circle as their symbol because she was martyred on a Catherine wheel. And it also seemed appropriate to have this big circle in the background because they had a big window there, but also it's a bit like the lens of a microscope. And so David is seen against that, so that a lot of his research is contained in that background imagery. But you see, he also has this extraordinary shirt which exactly matched that flower he's holding, which is exactly the opposite colour to the yellow of the primrose in there. So these other little odd things happening in there. And the tie is a Vivienne Westwood tie. In the background, there's John Ray's and actually talking about the pulsatilla that David is holding. And he was a great botanist and held in high regard by David. And meeting with him led on to my visiting scholarship at the University of Cambridge, looking at plants, drawing them in the herbarium, but also in the libraries, and looking at herbals, looking at collections and drawings and possible medical cures, looking at all that aspect of plant imagery. Because I'd used plants quite a lot before, but this was a kind of almost a new departure, so that I could look at herbarium species, which are very, very two-dimensional. They're not real, but they're incredibly real, if you see what I mean, but they're not illusionary. And there was also some sort of poetry going on with the labels. You could see how old some of these plants were just by the handwriting of the collectors or by the ancient typewriter that had written out an accession label. And there was also the opportunity just to study plants just for the sake of it. I like this drawing very much. I think it is because it was so blooming difficult to do. It's on Japanese paper, and it was laid down after it was drawn. So when I was working with it, and it's about that sort of size. So when I was working with it, it was moving about in the wind, and it was blowing about, and it was really difficult. But there was a kind of joy in that, to try and pin down the quality of that plant. And it proved a sort of starting point for other, and a reference for other paintings about plants. Now, we moved to Venice. When I say moved, we actually bought a studio over there about 16 years ago now. And Mike and I found that it was an incredibly gentle place to be, because partly nobody knew our backstory, all of that tragedy that happened in our lives. We could be anonymous over there, but also Venice has got this quality of survival. It's also got this quality of transience and fragility. And David Ingram did an exhibition at Lancaster University with a lot of my work and some Ruskin drawings of Venice as well, and of plants, which was entitled Timelessness and Fragility. So this is the kind of thing I was looking at and drawing when we live in the Giudecca, which is like where you are here, and we're looking back at Venice. And it's wonderful because it's incredibly peaceful. And you've got that strange thrill of knowing that if you want to be there and see those things, they're all there. So a lot of the paintings became about layers, time passing. If you think back to the Jennie Armstrong paintings again, it was that kind of, this idea that images build up and the kind of acquiescence can show you the passage of time and wear and tear. And the figure in this is a Bellini picture that's in the Accademia, which is Virgin and Child between two saints. And she is supposed to be the Mary Magdalene. And it was one of the most beautiful paintings I think I ever saw. A real icon, if we go back to that again. And she became almost a kind of visual symbol for Venice, for me. This gaze which survived. This one's called Quiet Rialto. It's I put it in really just because Venice is also about how the mundane life goes on. People row boats backwards and forwards. And yet there are these images which are kind of timeless. And the flood of colour and texture, it's very much about what the city is for me. So for many years, this was very, very important to both Mike and myself. This one is called Twilight Venice, and again, it's done from our terrace, our studio room. It has the Leonardo St. John hand, which I think is absolutely a beautiful thing. And again, what is it saying? What is it telling you? Juxtaposed with the skyline of Venice and the twilight coming in, and some of the aspects of the city during the day, with reflection on water, and all the richness below. This is the starting point for the tapestry at the Dovecote, which they've just finished, which has taken the middle section. So if you go down there, you'll be able to see it. I haven't said much about my daughter, but she does haunt my pictures. And again, this is very much a remembered image of Venice. The Fortuna Fabric, they have a workshop over there. It's the most beautiful velvets and printed textiles, which echo this richness of the city, with fragments, drawings pinned up around the studio of the view on the other side, and memory of Gemma looking like an Italian head. I think at the same time, I was interested in this idea of the two worlds. This is a painting that's called Mirror of the South, and it was painted when I came back from Venice. We'd spent a couple of months out there, and obviously that's the Venice side, and came back to this incredibly beautiful, cold, rational part of my life. And I was thinking, because sometimes when you're over there, you think, well, let's just stay here and we can ditch all these difficult issues, but you can't. Life is made up of the two whole aspects. And so this was very much thinking about the internal world and the external world and how we balance that. And that was something that I started particularly when I painted Thea Musgrave, Scottish-American composer, that I went to the States to paint. And the blue screen behind her is an amalgam of things we talked about, but also visual things that we'd seen, because in the course of painting the portrait, her husband was putting on a production of opera, and we were lucky enough to see it. It was Norma. We were lucky enough to see it from when the kids were running around on the stage with T-shirts and jeans, right the way through to full dress performance. And this whole idea of illusion was something that we talked very much about when I was painting Thea. And you see the little figure right on the right-hand side. That happened when we were watching, that somebody just kind of came down through the exit and the whole spell was broken because you suddenly saw this figure coming in. And that takes me right back to something R.D. Laing said, which was, we were talking about Las Maninas, and he was talking about the figures right at the back of the mirror, just making that step down into this totally illusory space. So it was kind of connecting up all those ideas with this very strong, creative, wonderful, and great friend. And we're talking about different kinds of worlds, and here's another kind of different world. It was when I painted Peter Higgs. I tried my hardest to understand everything he told me. I don't think I came near to it, but I think I hope I came near to the way we often think of that as a mysterious thing. We that don't know, we that aren't scientists, think about this kind of creative magic almost. Sorry, Peter. And for me, the thing was this incredible kind of solid humanity of the man with these extraordinary and powerful ideas. I very much like the light in Peter's sitting room, because I think I'm right in saying that the colour and the decor and the furniture and the light hadn't really altered for years and years and years. And it's almost like a parallel from when Peter first made the discovery of, or first made the possibility of the boson, when he first began to talk about that and how long it took before it was confirmed in CERN. So there's a lot of other kind of messages there. And Peter wrote out the formula for me, which I copied as best as I could on the side there. And that as well comes and goes. It doesn't give you any definite, it doesn't say categorically, this is what it's about. There's a lot of suggestion there, which is what I think artists can do and scientists can't. Arthur's Seat. This was when we had a studio up at near Carlton Hill. And it was looking at the changing light. We had huge, great windows looking out onto that view of Arthur's Seat. And it was wonderful seeing the light change throughout a single day, from the light in the morning and the kind of reality here to the light of evening, going, when the colour is going down and down and down, and you're just aware of little bits of artificial colour. So again, that two contrasts. This is a painting called Considered Silence. And this is sort of typical of a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 7, 8 years. And it's to do with the last of the light, if you like, and the stillness of the natural world. And in this painting, it's the moment before, you know, if you're inside and you're looking at the landscape outside and you haven't put the lights on and there's that wonderful intensity, and you go and flick a light switch on and the whole thing goes, it all disappears. It becomes dark and it just becomes a reflection. So it was that kind of almost precious moment, very, very intense moment that I was trying to capture. Similar sort of thing in West Linton, looking at the way the winter light can do amazing things with landscapes, so that you get part of a hillside in shadow, so the snow is blue and cold, the trees are blue, and then you get this piece of light moving across. I mean, I said at the beginning I kind of wished I was an abstract painter, and I can't do it, you see. I mean, I would love that to be like a fantastic Rothko, where you just have those shimmering bands of colour. But I'm so drawn to the reality and the beauty of what is out there, I can't actually do that. I can never give up on the real world, much as I would like to sometimes. And Blue Snow and Fiery Trees, again, it's taking that idea of the intensity of the cold and the blue and the shadow with the kind of almost burning heat of winter sun. You know, when the sun is so low, it has that, in winter, it has that kind of red colour to it. So it makes a very, very dramatic kind of contrast, a very unreal aspect to the landscape. About this time, I was looking at a lot of the Winterreise poetry by Muller, and he talks about snow burning, so that you've got this idea of something being so cold it actually burns. So that was a sort of subtext to this painting as well. Now, I had 2 or 3 residencies at Dumfries House, working in the studios there, which were amazing. I mean, it was like being a student again, because you didn't have to cook any meals. You've got little tickets and you could go and get your sausage and mash or whatever. And there were other students there, so there's about 4 studios. And you had nothing to do at all except paint, think, walk in the landscape, reflect. It was an absolute gift. And these great mature trees were like a sort of screen in front of me, which changed. I went in the winter twice and the spring once, and the light changing very short days. But then when I went back to the student flat and looked out the windows, there it was at night time as well. So I started thinking about how much I could make the landscape darker and darker and darker, and yet still register. So these are a whole sort of series of things that I tried to do, looking at different sorts of light source. But what a gift that residency is. I think it's one of the things that we do at the Royal Scottish Academy is the programme of residencies. They are extremely worthwhile and valuable. And this painting attempts to bring together so many things. It's called Venetian Mirror with Reflected Landscape. And of course it's a landscape of Scotland, but there's the structure of the Venetian mirror that's worn so that in places you're seeing just the black silvering where part of the mirror is flaked away. In other places you're seeing little bits of reflection from way back, and in other places you're seeing areas of sunlight which come down and again break up the kind of reality. It's quite a contemplative painting. It is almost kind of Rothko-like, isn't it? Now, about that time, I got an award from the Royal Scottish Academy to do one of the most sort of exciting things, actually, that I've ever done, which was a collaboration with an opera singer called Matthew Rose, who's incredibly famous now. Luckily for me, he wasn't so famous then. And he'd seen the big tapestry, the large tree group, which is in the museum in Scotland. And he'd been inspired to ask whether we could perhaps put some images together when he was giving a performance of Winterreise. And we did a performance at Snape Maltings, we did a performance at the Wigmore Hall, this was in 2017, and we did a performance in the Netherlands, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, a place called Wisp, which did their chamber music festival. And so we made a 70-minute video which was played behind the performers as they were singing. And in Snape Maltings, the projection was even bigger than that. It was about 25 feet. In Wigmore Hall, we couldn't get it quite as big. But I'd like to show you now, just like to finish this evening with, I think it's 1 minute and 40 of Winterreise. And it just shows you, it's song number 7, which is about how slowly the river has frozen over, how slowly it's moving under ice, and how the protagonist is remembering his sweetheart.
Soll auch so reißend schwillt mein Herz in diesem Mache. Erkennst du nun dein Bild? Absonte seine Rinde voll auf so reißend schwillt. ob's voll auch so reißend schwillt, ob's voll auch so reißend schwillt.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I'm sure there are many questions. Well, some at the back here.
Why was it called Monk's Cottage?
The question was, why was it called Monk's Cottage? Yeah, Jennie's was Monk's Cottage, ours was Monk's View, and it was supposed to be a general monk who, there's like two reasons. A general monk who put down the Covenanters, and the other reason was that there, at Newhall, which was quite nearby, there was an abbey.
And I would have thought that as a shepherd, summer and spring would be business.
Yeah, the question was, why were so many of the Jennie Armstrong things done in winter rather than in spring and summer when the shepherd would be out with the lambs? Well, when we knew her, she'd retired from hill shepherding, where she used to have about 2,000 sheep on the Pentlands, and so she had quite a small flock. Now, when we were there in the 70s, there were longer winters, so we had snow for months and months and months, and it's incredibly beautiful. And I find summer, I've used this phrase many times, too real. I can't stand painting trees with leaves on. I like to see the structure. So really that was why.
You seem to be the master of layering in your artwork, and I wonder, do you take away as much as you, is it an applying and then taking away? So it's a sort of technical question.
Yeah, the question was about layering, and is as much taken away as put on. Maybe in some of the student things I maybe took more away than I do now. I always start a painting with a whole lot of stuff wash on it because I don't like, nobody likes white canvas. And also it makes you think about the painting coming out of the support rather than you imposing it. I'm not meaning that I use it as an accident, but it's like kind of establishing a ground and then working through.
Earlier in your talk, you said you'd left religion or the church. Could you give me more detail about that?
Oh dear, it's Catholic guilt.
Oh, is it Catholic? Right.
I was educated at a grammar school in Wimbledon that was run by nuns, and my parents were converts, and so it was a very, very important part. That was kind of me making a framework of the world, and this seemed to be very, very central to it. But as I got older, there were all sorts of things that were happening that weren't fitting into this kind of crystal framework. And rather than do something half-heartedly, I thought, no, right, I will just stop.
Stop believing in God, or just stop being a Roman Catholic?
Stop organised religion.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the effect Venice had on your painting, because having seen the show at the City Arts Centre, the thing that struck me was how you reflected something that appears in Venetian painting itself, and also in Scott's painters going to Venice, particularly I'm thinking of Charles Mackay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the colour and the light in Venice is the clarity, and in the background in some of the Bellini paintings, for example, of the landscape, clouds and mountainsides, rivers, it's quite exquisite. I think it's always a bit of a trap because Venice has been painted so many times by so many people you've got to kind of avoid the cliche of it, and it's very easy to get into that trap. So I found by concentrating on the drawing and maybe looking at light in the way that I did, that hopefully that got around that problem.
You mentioned the fantastic work of Malevich and the fourth dimension, and I was wondering if you ever feel like that's been achieved in art, or whether you believe in the fourth dimension. You blend the reality of real life and also the reality that you create on your own canvas. So perhaps that could be touching to the fourth dimension.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a little quote I was reading about how Soviet theatre had managed to do exactly that by ignoring the traditional aspects of reality and instead just concentrating on, not just on time, but upon extraordinary sort of juxtapositions that took you away from the normal physical here and now. And I don't know if it has been done in painting. I don't know. In my experience, all I can say is that it's worked for me because it has, in my sense, worked well. For me, internally, I mean, I don't know if anybody else would agree, but for me, the paintings do transcend the reality that I see.
I just had to ask this question. I mean, it's a fabulous journey you've been on with and developments. You've taken us through that. Where now?
Oh, well, normally I quite dread that question, but I tell you what, I don't know what I'm going to paint next, but I know who I want to paint. And that's Lady Hale with her spider.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I speak for everyone here that this has been a very special occasion. I feel very privileged. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ross McDougall of the National Galleries of Scotland for his technical assistance, and the National Galleries of Scotland themselves for their kind permission to use the Hawthorne-Dean
Thank you, and there's some of their slides will be.
Absolutely, and also the staff of the Royal Scottish Academy for helping facilitate this tonight as well. But Victoria, this was a wonderful, illuminating and revealing presentation by one of our most outstanding artists. We've been so lucky in Edinburgh to have so much to see of your work, and to be enhanced tonight is amazing. We've just been treated to the most intimate and unique insights into your working practices, inspiration and motivation. Fantastic to listen to. And for me, to hear you talk about the perceived wisdom of the male tutors at Edinburgh College of Art. I remember those, and you were a breath of fresh air in first year coming in, along with one or two other female tutors who saw things slightly differently, and it was great for me. I love the idea of icons in the landscape. It's a theme that runs through all your work, whether the icons are there or not, and I think that is wonderful to see. We're looking forward, somebody asked about what's next, but we're looking forward to so much to your next body of work, which will no doubt surpass all that has gone before. Thank you so much for taking the time to prepare and present this wonderful lecture. I'm sure it will resonate and inspire many of us to years to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you.